Before Clayton Moore became a legend in black and white, he was flying through the air with no mask at all, literally. Born Jack Carlton Moore in Chicago in 1914, he grew up obsessed with movement, strength, and showmanship. By his early 20s, he had already joined a traveling circus as a trapeze artist. Swinging high above gasping crowds, Moore developed a physical presence and discipline that would later define his on-screen persona. But Hollywood was calling, and Moore wasn't about to ignore it. He headed west and quickly found small roles in serials and westerns. He had the chiseled jaw, deep voice, and commanding stare producers loved. But it wasn't until 1949 that his fate changed forever. A new television series was launching, one based on a popular radio drama. It needed a masked lawman with gravitas and grit. Moore got the part. And just like that, the Lone Ranger was born on screen. What Moore didn't expect was just how fast it would take over his life. Overnight, he went from a struggling stuntman to a household name. Kids across America were donning cowboy hats and shouting, "Hi-yo, Silver." But what made Moore different from most actors was that he didn't just play the Lone Ranger. He became him. In public appearances, interviews, and charity events, he insisted on staying in character. He lived by the Ranger's code. No smoking. No swearing. Always act with honor. To fans, it was inspiring. To studio executives, it was complicated. Moore's dedication made him beloved, but behind the scenes, it created tension. Hollywood wanted actors who followed contracts, not moral codes. When Moore started asking for a raise in the early 1950s, the studio balked. They didn't like how much influence he had over the show's image. To them, Moore wasn't a partner. He was just a face behind a mask they could replace. And they proved it. In 1952, just 3 years into the show's success, Moore was suddenly dropped. No warning, no public explanation. The producers slid in another actor, John Hart, to play the role. Fans are confused. Ratings dipped. But Moore, he was furious. This wasn't just a job to him. It was an identity. And losing it wasn't just a professional blow. It was personal. Even after being reinstated a year later due to fan backlash, something had shifted. Moore had learned a brutal truth. In Hollywood, even heroes were disposable. The mask might have made him famous, but it didn't protect him from the games behind the scenes. And as we'll see next, Moore wasn't the only one feeling the heat on set. On screen, they were the perfect duo, the Lone Ranger and Tonto, riding side by side across the Old West in perfect harmony. But off-screen, things weren't always so simple. Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels built one of the most iconic partnerships in television history. What most fans didn't know at the time was that behind the carefully controlled studio image, there were signs of quiet tension, resentments that grew over time but were never openly discussed. Jay Silverheels, born Harold J. Smith, was a Mohawk actor and athlete from Canada. He was one of the first Native American actors to land a recurring lead role on a major network show, a groundbreaking achievement. But the role of Tonto came with baggage. Silverheels was frequently expected to play into outdated and reductive stereotypes. His character spoke in broken English and rarely got to lead a scene. Meanwhile, Moore, ever the noble lawman, was positioned as a heroic centerpiece. Silverheels knew what was happening. He played along for the sake of the show, but privately, he wasn't happy. While Moore was embraced as a real-life hero by the public, Silverheels was often overlooked, even disrespected, despite being a critical part of the show's success. Some reports claim that during press events, Silverheels was sometimes excluded or spoken over. The studios didn't hide who they wanted to promote, and though Moore himself wasn't publicly hostile, sources say there was a professional distance between the two. There are stories that Moore, always a perfectionist, insisted on certain camera angles and scene priorities that left Silverheels in the background. Nothing explosive, no public blow-ups, but enough quiet friction that cast and crew noticed. One former crew member later admitted, "You could tell Jay knew his role was limited and it wore on him. Clayton was the Lone Ranger even when the cameras weren't rolling. Jay, He knew he was playing a role that wasn't always fair. Still, they remained professionals. Both men understood the weight of the roles they were playing, especially to young viewers watching at home. And despite the imbalance, Silverheels stayed committed. He showed up, delivered, and maintained a working relationship with Moore that lasted through nearly a decade of production. But under the surface, the gap between their public personas and private realities only grew. The irony? In many ways, Silverheels had more experience, more range, and arguably more to prove. But he was stuck in a role that limited him, and Moore, intentionally or not, benefited from that imbalance. Whether it was a studio design or the result of personal ambition, the dynamic left a mark. What came next would test both men's patience and nearly shatter the entire brand. At the height of the Lone Ranger's success, everything seemed locked in place. Ratings were booming. The show was a cultural phenomenon, and Clayton Moore had become the masked face of American heroism. But in 1952, fans across the country were blindsided. Without warning, the voice, the mannerisms, and even the physical presence of the Lone Ranger changed. Same costume, same horse, but it wasn't Clayton Moore under the mask anymore. It was another actor entirely, John Hart. The switch confused everyone. Kids tuning in after school couldn't understand why their favorite hero suddenly looked different. Parents wrote in. Newspapers speculated. And behind the scenes, a quiet power struggle had just reached its boiling point. Clayton Moore had asked for more money. Not millions, just a raise that reflected the show's runaway success. By that time, he was making public appearances in full costume, helping the network promote the brand, and living as a Lone Ranger even when the cameras were off. But the producers at Rather Corporation didn't like how indispensable he was becoming. To them, Moore was just another actor, one they could replace if he got too difficult. And that's exactly what they tried to do. John Hart, a seasoned B-movie actor with similar build and voice, was brought in to fill the mask. The studio hoped fans wouldn't notice, or at least wouldn't care. But they were wrong. From the very first episode Hart appeared in, the feedback was overwhelmingly negative. Viewers knew something was off. Hart didn't move the same way, didn't speak with the same tone, and, perhaps most importantly, didn't carry the same mystique. Moore had become the Lone Ranger, and that aura couldn't be duplicated. Hart did his best. He filmed 52 episodes and later said in interviews that he was proud of the work. But he also admitted it was a thankless task. Fans never accepted him in the role. In fact, some blame his casting for the dip in ratings during that year. The chemistry was gone, the magic faded. And eventually, the studio was forced to admit the truth. The mask wasn't the star, Clayton Moore was. By 1954, Moore was back in the saddle, literally. The studio quietly rehired him, never fully acknowledging the mistake. Hart was let go without ceremony, and the original Lone Ranger returned to a hero's welcome. But something had changed. Moore had learned that his position wasn't bulletproof. Despite carrying the show, he could be cast aside at any moment. And the studio had learned, too, that some icons can't be replaced without consequences. The attempted swap left a mark on the show's legacy and on Moore himself. From that point forward, he became even more protective of the Ranger's image. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He was on a mission, but that fierce dedication would later land him in serious legal trouble. Because when the studio tried to take away more than just a role, he didn't go quietly. By the late 1970s, Clayton Moore had become something rare in Hollywood, a former TV star who was more beloved after his show ended. Even though the Lone Ranger had gone off the air in the 50s, Moore never stopped being the masked man. He made countless public appearances for decades afterward, visiting schools, hospitals, and charity events in full costume. To many fans, he was still the Lone Ranger, and in his mind, he always would be. But then, in 1979, something happened that shocked both Moore and the public. He was legally ordered to stop wearing the mask. The move came from Rather Corporation, which owned the rights to the Lone Ranger franchise. They were preparing to release a big-budget film reboot and wanted full control of the character's image. Moore, now in his 60s, was seen as a relic of the past and a potential marketing problem. Studio execs feared his continued appearances in costume might confuse audiences and take attention away from their new movie star. So, they filed a lawsuit and successfully banned him from wearing the black mask in public. The ruling devastated Moore. For decades, he had protected the Lone Ranger's legacy, treating the character not just as a role, but as a moral standard. To him, the mask wasn't just a prop. It was a symbol of everything he stood for. The idea that a corporate boardroom could strip that away felt like betrayal at the highest level. But Moore didn't fold. In classic Lone Ranger fashion, he found a loophole and made a statement. He began appearing in public again, wearing the full costume, minus the original mask. Instead, he donned a pair of wraparound sunglasses to comply with the court order while still embodying the spirit of the character. It was bold, symbolic, and deeply personal. Fans rallied behind him. Media outlets covered the story nationwide. And while the studio pushed forward with their new film, Moore quietly became a public hero once again. This time, not for saving fictional towns, but for standing up for what he believed in. Ironically, the 1981 Lone Ranger reboot that Rather had bet everything on, it flopped hard. The movie was panned by critics, bombed at the box office, and left audiences cold. No amount of money or marketing could recreate what Moore had built naturally over decades. You can replace an actor, but you can't fake legacy. Eventually, the backlash became too loud to ignore. In 1984, 5 years after the lawsuit, the court ruling was quietly reversed. Moore was free to wear the mask again. He didn't say much about it, but when he made his next public appearance, mask back in place, the standing ovation said it all. But this wasn't the end of Moore's battles with Hollywood. Because the truth about how badly the studio mishandled everything, that wouldn't come out until years later. For years, the studio line was simple. Clayton Moore's image as the Lone Ranger was outdated, and they needed to protect the brand. But as the dust settled from the 1979 mask ban, former insiders began to speak out, and what they revealed painted a very different picture. The ban wasn't just about a reboot. It was about control, resentment, and a desperate attempt to bury the man who was a brand. At the heart of it all was producer Jack Rather. He had bought the rights to the Lone Ranger in the 1950s, betting that the character could become a cross-generational icon. And he wasn't wrong. Moore helped make it happen. But over time, Rather grew uneasy about just how much credit Moore was getting. Fans didn't care who owned the rights. To them, Moore was a Lone Ranger, and that presented a problem. From a business standpoint, Rather saw Moore's continued public appearances, free, unpaid, and done out of loyalty, as a threat. Every time Moore showed up in full costume, signing autographs and preaching the Ranger Code, it reminded the public that the heart of the character wasn't owned by a corporation. It belonged to a man. That terrified the suits. Then came the 1981 movie. Rather was desperate to launch a modern version of the franchise, casting newcomer Clinton Spilsbury in the lead role. The problem? Moore was still everywhere, county fairs, parades, talk shows. Even in his 60s, he was stealing headlines. So Rather made the cold calculation: remove the competition. If they could legally force Moore out of the spotlight, the audience would have no choice but to embrace the new guy. But they underestimated the backlash. Once the lawsuit went public, it backfired spectacularly. Moore became a martyr for fans. A man in his golden years, who had stayed loyal to a single role for decades, was suddenly being bullied by a corporation trying to erase his legacy. The press had a field day. Editorials slammed the move as heartless and greedy. And when the movie bombed, earning less than half its budget, Rather's vision crumbled completely. What made things worse? The actor they cast, Clinton Spilsbury, wasn't even allowed to use his real voice in the final cut. The producers had to dub him overdue to poor line delivery. It was a disaster on every level. The man who had been shoved out, Clayton Moore, was still standing tall, while the studio's fresh face faded into obscurity. Years later, former production staff admitted that Rather had tried to erase Moore from the narrative entirely, not because he was bad for business, but because he wasn't controllable. He wouldn't play ball. He wouldn't stay quiet. And that terrified them more than anything. But Moore had something the studio never could buy: authenticity. And in the court of public opinion, that mattered more than any legal document. What happened next only cemented that legacy when Clayton Moore turned the tables one last time. By the mid-1980s, the dust had finally settled. The legal battles were over. The failed movie reboot had come and gone, and the world had spoken. There was only one Lone Ranger, and his name was Clayton Moore. With the mask ban lifted, Moore resumed public appearances. This time not as a disgrace has been, but as a legend. His return wasn't loud or vengeful. There were no press conferences or "I told you so" moments. He simply put the mask back on, climbed atop silver once more, and picked up where he left off, visiting children's hospitals, leading parades, giving interviews, and standing up for the values the Ranger represented. By now, Moore was in his 70s, but he carried himself with the same quiet dignity he had on-screen decades earlier. He still recited the Ranger's code with sincerity, still signed every autograph with care, and still refused to accept money for many of his public appearances. For him, this wasn't about profit. It was about principle. Even Hollywood, which had once tried to shove him aside, began to change its tune. In 1987, Moore was given a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. That same year, he was inducted into the Western Performers Hall of Fame at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. The industry that once tried to silence him was now honoring him, not because they had to, but because the fans never let them forget. And then, in 1999, after decades of being the face behind a mask, Clayton Moore passed away at the age of 85. He died in his California home, surrounded by family. But the public tribute was massive. Headlines across the country marked the passing of the Lone Ranger. Not just the actor. Tributes poured in. Former co-stars, fans, and even critics acknowledged what Moore had become: a rare example of someone who didn't just play a hero, but lived as one. Even in death, Moore kept things symbolic. He was buried with a replica of his famous mask in his casket, a final, quiet statement that he never stopped being the character he brought to life. And truthfully, no one ever expected him to. His legacy wasn't just about silver bullets and cowboy hats. It was about integrity in a business known for betrayal, about loyalty in an industry that forgot its own, and about a man who refused to let lawyers, studios, or public relations firms dictate what was right. Clayton Moore didn't need a billion-dollar franchise. He didn't need a comeback tour or a tell-all memoir. He had something far more powerful: the respect of generations and the love of millions who grew up believing in heroes, because he never stopped being one.